Ashley's bachelorette party. And that was the merging of two families at a bachelorette party. One family was a conservative Muslim, which I'm not, but yeah, I know, but anyway. Conservative Mormon, and they're actually somewhat similar. And a very pro-progressive, lefty, feminist family. And how they all get along and realize that there's a lot of common ground. And by day, I work for a social change nonprofit as the human resources manager and the communications specialist. And we're hiring. If you have any experience in project management, strategic planning, or working with people at the intersections of poverty and violence, working with sexual and domestic violence survivors, looking at a way to change how we frame people's issues. Instead of trying to fix problems, we try to incorporate well-being into their lives. And before I even started working there, I think I've always kind of felt that way about how I write and how I like to not so much constantly accentuate the positive, but to frame the story of, say, what we might others think of as the other in a positive way that's more normalizing and not always like the tragic person who has these things because they're a person's life.
So I am Kat Jones. I am a game designer, and I write about games, and I run games, and my day job is as a professor, and I have taught sociology classes, I have taught gender studies classes, I have taught game design classes, and as a game designer, I tend to think about feminism a lot as I'm writing games, and think about how to examine feminist issues in my games, think about how to maybe examine topics that sort of look at systemic oppression in various ways. So as Julia mentioned, we collaborated on these games about sex toy parties. That is the unifying factor of those games. And so getting people to talk about subjects and using games as a space to allow people to talk about subjects that they might not otherwise talk about in their everyday lives is something that I do a lot in my games.
My name is Maury Brown, and I am an educator, games designer, producer, and I guess I write about games too. Game scholar. And I have an undergraduate degree in women's studies, and then I haven't finished my PhD, but it is on rhetoric and cultural studies, particularly in gaming, and particularly using feminist rhetoric to develop more collaborative and consensual types of games, rather than what is typically, in a lot of games, use agonistic rhetoric, which is competitive or fighting or saying that my point of view or my thing is better than yours, rather than coming to consensus. And it's interesting because that's how I approach all my game design. I was just in a panel where they talked about a company hired a group to design an experience to train their employees to develop a new mission. And the game that these guys developed was a competitive sports type game where at the end, like, there were competing missions that were, and I was like, I would have approached that so differently, right, to go through. So also I'm the lead designer for Emerton. Kat is one of the co-designers for that, which is a game by women for women that's designed to help look at what the experience of being a woman is, and it deals with a lot of feminist intersectionalities. So it's a huge part of what I do. Even the games that aren't about women or about women's issues, I'm trying to use feminist design principles to upend hierarchies and question binaries and put non-masculine identities in positions of power, or demonstrate other ways of being that are non-patriarchal, those sorts of things. So even if the game isn't ostensibly, even if the game is like about wizards, for example,
Randomizing.
there are these things that are going on in it, and people are there casting magic, and then later on they go, oh, wait, you know. So that's, which is, from my opinion, is if you beat people over the head with it, they often tune it out. Whereas if they experience something and then get the aha moment later, did you do that on purpose? Of course not. So cool.
Excellent. So I guess we here at Living Games Conference hate definitions. So now I'm going to ask you guys for definitions. What is, to you, feminist game design? What does that mean?
Document.
Prepared. Excellent.
Wow.
Sorry. Only for this question.
It's going to be all improv for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you want me to read some from my document?
Yeah.
Bounce off.
Yeah, there you go.
All right. So to design with feminist principles then means avoiding false binaries like man versus woman, masculine versus feminine, white versus black, able-bodied versus disabled, all those sorts of things. Designing to question or subvert traditional patriarchal power structures and hierarchies. Questioning assumptions about social norms and defaults and erasure that might actually intrude into game design or play. Deliberate fostering of safety, value, and agency for players. Designing to consider player needs and not just game design. And acknowledging privilege and fostering ways to challenge it are some of the things that I had, or what feminist game design means.
Gosh, okay. I feel like I've like used up my like
Language.
pithy sayings in the last panel.
Go. Okay. So yesterday, I'll tell the story. Yesterday, I was getting my stuff ready, and I've noticed that I have two kids. I have a 13-year-old and an 18-year-old, so almost 19. And the 18-year-old is going through her stuff and getting rid of clothes and things like that, and giving them to the 13-year-old. And so there's a lot of chaos in our laundry at the moment. So I was looking for some shirts and things to wear here, and rifled through, and I was like, wait, this isn't mine, this is B's. Oh, okay. And I came up with this shirt, and I remember in college, the first time I saw this phrase, and I thought it was a little bit different, but I liked the way it was phrased. So I went to a women's college in Massachusetts, and at the time, in the late 80s, early 90s, there was this shirt that said, feminism is the crazy idea that women are human beings. Yeah. And I was like, wow, that's sticking around, and now they sell it at Target. So, and so to me, that has always sort of stuck out as just like a very basic, simple explanation of feminism. That it is the acknowledgement that that humanity goes beyond the masculine, and so I would say that in game design, feminist game design, that is the acknowledgement that there's more than one way to skin a cat, or
just love the cat.
Or just love the cat. Yes, and if you are the cat skinning kind, that there is a place for you in the game as well. That you don't have to conform to a certain identity to be a cat skinner.
Okay, so I'm thinking. So I think feminist game design for me, is a lot about correcting certain erasures. And that can be designing games that tell narratives that are not told often in games or in other media. It can be about examining particular themes or topics that sort of challenge assumptions that we might have or challenge power relations. I think for me, I often have sort of games that fall more in the like awareness category. That's like, hey, you should be aware of this thing that happens, or this form of systematic oppression, or this topic that you might not have thought about but is perhaps important for you to think about. And then I think of feminist game design as this sort of joyful celebration of the stories that don't often get told, right? The narratives, the characters, the topics that are often overlooked, that are seen as frivolous, that are seen as unimportant, that are seen as less worthy of space and time. And I think that really encompasses sort of how I approach feminist game design.
I'll piggyback onto that, is that not only is it stories that are not told for me, but it's also things that are not considered appropriate for games.
Yes.
Yes. And so on a consultant project that I was working on, like the lead person was a guy who was just, everything had to be epic, no, here we go. And I was like, no, there are these small moments, and like convincing them to put into the game design moments for people where they're sitting down over the glass of wine and they're talking to each other and maybe gossiping about this thing over here. And they're like, that's so boring. And I'm like, this is a real experience that people enjoy and want to do. And also, narrative design, you can't have everything being all the time, right? You need to like settle down so that their endorphins settle down a little bit more, and then they can flip the table and get back up, something. But they're also, hey, if this person comes to your game and never actually does one of your epic things, but sits here, can have a really good experience, and like that's like mind-blowing for some people who think that gaming has to be competitive or has to be epic or about war, or or these sorts of things. And so a lot of what I do is trying to bring that lens down to other types of ways to play.
I'm interested in hearing from all of you about your experience of how games have changed over time as we've developed our dialogue on women's issues, and as these things have kind of come more into the limelight, like how that's changed the gaming landscape from your perspectives.
I actually haven't. I started playing role-playing games and LARPs in my late 30s, mid-30s, and I'm in my late 40s, so there's a span of time. But one thing that I can say that I've noticed is, the first thing I always look at is the art, and is that art, if you look at the art, do you feel like you are not just represented, but not like insulted? And I don't mean that in like this delicate sensibility kind of way. Like I love cheesecake art. I have a big cheesecake pin-up lady on my arm. So I appreciate that. But there's a way that you can look at it and be like, that's cheesecake, rather than it's cheesecake. And so I've noticed that there's a shift. So I think for a while, I think we were like, no, the armor has to match. And and yes, if you're drawing somebody who is a warrior, you have to cover certain parts, even if that's not what your audience wants to see. That, let's be realistic. Let's just take that piece and take that apart. And I think part of that is not just women going, I can't engage in this, but like that lots of people are saying, this is crap, this is boring, I'm tired of seeing this. This is so like 1970s Frank Vanzetta, it's like nothing about it. But that there was a trope there, and so now it's evolving. And I think it's evolving because people are starting to say, I really want to see myself in this way, and if you're not going to show me exactly how I look, at least show somebody that I can identify with that doesn't turn me off and make me disgusted as a person.
So for me, I feel like one of the things that I've noticed is that there are more spaces available to have these kinds of experiences, which are maybe not the sort of traditional patriarchal, misogynistic gaming experiences. And I see this a lot at conventions. So I've been going to Origins, which is a very fraught space, as some of you may know. And when I started going to Origins, it was not unusual for me to have at least one negative experience at the gaming table that was related to the fact either that I was a woman player or that I was playing a woman character in the game. And that is no longer the case, right? That I feel much more comfortable sitting down at tables, feeling like I'm not going to be the only woman at the table, feeling like there are going to be stories that are told that are much more nuanced and aren't necessarily all about competition, and that are sort of cognizant of issues of gender and representation and all of these things that, you know, it was like maybe I'd get the one game that did that in the early years, and now it's like I can go and that can be my entire game experience for the weekend. And I feel like it's not that the other stuff doesn't exist, because it's still there, but it doesn't take up as much space, and there's more space for the other stuff that's doing something different.
I started playing D&D and going to SCA and then to Vampire LARPs in mid-'80s. And then Vampire was later than mid-'80s, Vampire was early '90s, but and then I quit. And what I've noticed in terms of a change is, first of all, the roles that are available for women are far greater and far more diverse now. When we first, so many of the games either were seeking to have historical accuracy or replaying certain types of oppression. So SCA was very much, you know, a woman had to wear a dress and had to be my lady and had to do all these, and I got tired of it real quick, for multiple reasons. Not like, first of all, I don't really like being called a lady, you know, but also there was very stringently that a person of a female body could not play a character because that was breaking something. And Vampire LARPs were very, very gendered, and so some of the biggest changes that I think have happened is, first of all, some women, pioneering women, stuck their neck out and got themselves doxxed and harassed, and you know, and they paved the way for more people to sort of speak up, but also more women started making games. And then finally, some of the shift is that gaming companies realized that women buy games. Shockingly. Also, I think we're finally experiencing somewhat of a shift of people who are not women actually also don't want to play these games that replicate the kinds of oppressive systems, which is fantastic, because until you got to get the train moving. So you know, I think we got here on the backs of some women, you know, who spoke up and took the heat. I mean, that's almost like, you know, the pre-gamer gay, post-gamer gay notion for women in gaming and those things. So.
There's a couple things that people brought up that I want to circle back around to. One was the difference between sexuality and sexualization. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
Wow.
Kat has no thoughts. Yes, sex toy party people.
So I'm going to preface this by saying, in my day job as a sociologist, one of the things that I study is sexuality. So I'm really interested in sex. I'm interested in how people talk about it. I'm interested in how people think about it. I'm interested in, you know, all of these facets of sex. And I don't think that sex is something that has to be sort of prurient or, you know, pervy or whatever, right? Like I'm very much pro, like, let's normalize talking about sex. And so for me, there is a way in which sex often gets either completely erased in gaming spaces, right? We don't talk about that stuff. That's not, why would you want to play that, right? Or it gets ignored in certain ways and then gets brought up. You have the experience of your D&D party decides to go to the tavern and get some witches, which like literally happened to me when I was like 18 years old, and I was like, really? And so yeah, for me, I think that there's ways to have discussions about sexuality that recognize the like multiplicity of ways that people experience and understand sexuality, in ways that like sexuality is used to help us understand things about characters and their relationships, or to add particular things to the narrative, or in the case of our sex toy party games, like we just wanted a space where like talking about sex could be something like fun and kind of frivolous and maybe a little bit uncomfortable, because like when you're talking with your abuela about sex, like it's gonna be a little bit uncomfortable. But that it wouldn't be something that was seen as like dirty or nasty or like perverted, but just like a fun act that you can engage with people that you maybe know really well or maybe you don't know very well, and just have that sort of space to have those kinds of discussions.
To add to that, I was thinking about too, so in sexualization, sort of you're putting your assumptions or your fantasies onto somebody else. So sexualization requires an object. Whereas sexuality, it's more internal, it can be, I wrote intimate when I was thinking about that, but it doesn't even necessarily have to be intimate. But it is that you are, it's as if, so sexualization, you are, everybody's ha 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 talking about sex, and then you have that one person who doesn't really get that we're done with the conversation, and they keep going and they keep talking about like, well, yeah, we were talking about, having sex at a hotel, and then that person just keeps on going, and then later that night I went here and I met a prostitute, blah, 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 blah. And everybody's done with the conversation. And they're just continuing. Whereas with sexuality, everybody's a participant in this conversation. Everybody's like, oh yeah, I remember that time too. And so it can be, it can be kind of weird, and you can all be, like you said, uncomfortable. But everybody's a willing participant in the conversation, and a willing, has a way to give input in a discussion about sex. Whereas if you're just sexualizing somebody, it's like you're looking at a picture, and you could be looking at a picture of a goat, and you get better, sexualize that goat, and that's on you. That's on you. That goat had no say, and so it's the same thing when you're talking. You've had those conversations, right? Where someone just like, shut up.
Yeah, I would put the two in a matter of agency. Sexualization is done to you or reduces you to body parts or things that are zones or things that someone else finds sexual, and then says that's what it means rhetorically, right? That this is sexual and sexual. Whereas sexuality is something that you embody and that you project and that you have agency over. My presentation tomorrow is on corset wearing and LARP, which corsets are a very, very much an object that is used by the women who are responding, or the people who are responding, to portray sexuality in an empowering way, but also resisting being sexualized, which corsets previously had always meant that. Like, they were made and imposed upon women to make them look more hourglassy and more boobs and butt. Whereas if a woman then is choosing to wear the corset, and she wears it on the outside of the clothing, and she's like, this is sexuality that I am embracing. And so a lot of the feminist games, I think, allow women to embrace their sexuality, because so often, you get the virgin whore binary and the sort of thing. And so allowing women to have that space, and role play gives them the space where they can portray hypersexuality, whatever that means, but, but they can portray sexuality in a way that they might not feel safe doing it outside of a game space because of the social contract of the game itself. So it can be an explorative space for that sexuality.
I think that you brought up some really interesting things. So one of the things that comes to mind immediately is about like bodies and women's bodies, and I don't remember the exact statistics on it, but there's definitely there's research out there that basically a lot of sexual stereotypes that are put on women are put on women by other women. Mm-hmm. So how do you make it acceptable for a woman to embrace her sexuality in one of your games without being judged by the other women present at the game?
Ooh, should we talk about it?
Yeah, talk about it.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. It's a very good question. First of all, you have to make it you have to say it. You have to make it a rule, like that we just are not going to do this because women are socialized and don't even know a lot of times how they are judged. And women can judge. People can judge, but women are very much socialized often to judge without necessarily confronting, right? They do things like turn their back on you or do the look down, right? Or just these sorts of things. And so bringing up that in this feminist game space that there will be multiplicity of expressions of womanhood, and some are very sex positive and some are very... so one of my favorite things that happened at the first run of Imerton, the 4-day run, was that we had players who were 24 and players who were 60,
Yeah.
you know, and so we had all these amazing bodies and experiences of womanhood, and we had certain people who portrayed characters who were very sexy. Like sex was their way of embracing the world, and that being part of being a woman, and particularly in this all-woman environment, was a ways to express, was ways to express female to female or woman to woman desire, and it was all just beautiful because there were not. It was like that was her thing, and we celebrated that. And then we had asexual women over here who were interested in many other things, but not sex at all. And then the other thing that happened over the course of the 4 days is women's clothing and body language changed from being in this, just being around women in this feminist space. Women stopped wearing their bras, and they started sitting in ways that they didn't care if their legs were together or these other sorts of socialized. Yeah. Exactly. It was common. Yeah, and so it was really neat for a lot of people, particularly because they could see either where they were going as a woman, if they were younger, looking up, and then also maybe where they had been, or I was never that woman, but that's a way around it. So I think I answered the question sort of.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So one of the things that I think about is creating dynamics that explore that issue, but maybe do it in a way that challenges some assumptions. So Julia was talking a little bit about Ashley's bachelorette party, where we sort of deliberately pitted these two families against each other, right? We've got the very liberal and progressive sort of feminist family, and then we've got the conservative religious family. But we did a lot of deliberate things with the characters so that as they start off, the sort of assumption is, oh, these conservative religious people are going to be real judgy. And we wrote them so that they were not. So that the dynamic starts out with some of the characters being sort of a little bit deliberately provoking, to be like, oh, what are these conservative people going to think of me? And as they sort of challenge that assumption, suddenly the dialogue begins to shift. And as the game progresses, the sort of relationships between these different characters, we really wanted it to develop in these ways that would challenge some assumptions that people might be bringing with them, and that would sort of turn that judgment on its head a little bit.
Yes.
also helps to broaden the definition of what womanhood is and what it means to be a woman. So I have a couple of feelings about that. I'm just trying to form my thoughts. You had mentioned something earlier about being a lady. Kat and I have had a few conversations about this. So my mom's a history professor, and I have edited her stuff before. And one of the things that she was writing about at one point was about ladyhood and race, and what it means to be a lady. We'll just say in the United States, say maybe like in the late 1800s. If you were a black woman, regardless of your social economic status, and there were black women in the 1800s, black families who had some money, were middle class and upper middle class, they still couldn't be considered ladies. And so ladiness takes on also this racial aspect. And it becomes this thing that is unattainable for some people. I think we see that nowadays even more so with trans women and with non-binary women, that if you do not conform to a certain look, how your hair is, whether you do your hair, how what your face looks like, how do you have facial hair, do you have, how you stand, how tall you are. I'm almost 5'10", and I've often felt, not just because I'm a black woman, but also because I'm tall, that ladyhood is unattainable sometimes for me, because I'm not petite. I'm not, not skinny, and we've also looked at what it looks like to, like, the ideal of a woman or a lady in the 80s and 90s was looks like a heroin addict. And in the 1900s, it was to have tits and ass, and to have those accentuated. And so if you're looking like now, I think we can, ladyhood can be what you want it to be. It can be, I think if we broaden that definition of just womanhood and ladyhood, if you want to be a lady, and nobody's going to tell you otherwise. If you want to be a woman, if you identify as a woman, then what your body is shouldn't be the thing that defines you. Just as it shouldn't have been your race in the 1800s, and even now. You think about athletes, female athletes in particular, black female athletes, and look at the language that describes their fabulous moves. The Williams sisters, when they're described and they're winning, when they're not winning, it's in this very masculine, gendered way. But when you talk to them, they identify as women and as feminine women, but because they are strong, athletic women with lots of muscles, and they're black, ladyhood and womanhood is not what media sees. And so I think that in having games, like when you say you want to have women there, that you have that point from the beginning that everybody can be who they are.
And I think
that's a feminist principle.
Yes.
Too.
Yes.
And I think too, when we're talking about sexuality, like recognizing that sexuality is a fraught topic for women in general, but that if we're thinking intersectionally, right, sexuality is a fraught topic for different women in different ways, right? That being a woman who is working class or poor shapes your sexuality and how people perceive your sexuality in these very fundamental ways, right? How black women's sexuality is perceived, how the sexuality of Latinas is perceived, right? All of these things lead to particular judgments, particular assumptions that are also, I think, things that we can examine, we can make very explicit, we can recognize also through our games.
And we can change some of that. To preview my corset paper again, but it's like the corset as a costuming item in role play, as well as other things that we can do in role play, can change your status. So putting on the corset often meant you were a lady, right? And it caused you to stand straighter and to have more the ability to look down your nose. And just the reminder, and it was a shortcut to say person of means. Although some people conversely thought corsets meant like bordello, and which they might think was a person less of means, but the statistics bore out that it was more often associated with higher class women. And so role play or games can let us play with these types of feminist principles, both through mechanics but also through costuming.
So my next question has to do with women-only games and women-only spaces. I am really interested to hear your different perspectives on what that means when something is a women-only game and a women-only space, and how that ties back to feminism and some of the principles of feminism.
I occupy a lot of women-only spaces. I pray in women-only spaces. I appreciate my women friends. I think you can certainly use a women-only space to discriminate, because if you have a very narrow definition of what a woman is, then you're just going to have those folks. I found that when I was at Smith at a women's college, this was before trans women were specifically welcome, and that was. So our women's only spaces were of a particular type of woman. And now I enjoy my women only spaces, especially when that definition of womanhood is much more inclusive. And I find it incredibly valuable. I don't think it's a diss to men. You have the whole room, you have the whole world. I can give a quick little example. So this is not related to games at all. So when I go to a masjid, I often judge it by the space that I'm permitted to occupy. So I like mosques that women can pray side by side, or if they're praying behind, then they pray, there's no barrier, we're not on the second floor, or it's substandard, or the bathroom is crap, or you have to go out of the masjid and back around the corner. And I've experienced being in the biggest mosque in Western Mass, and it's I'm looking for the door, it's raining, and I just want to get out of the rain, and it's this tiny little door, and the space is this little space, and it's oh, I know this is a great mosque, why? I don't want to go back here. As opposed to going to a smaller mosque where someone puts up a barrier, the brother puts up a barrier, and then all the women are just move it over, and nobody says anything. It's the decision of the people who are occupying that space. If you're going to have us sit in a particular place, we want to have it look nice, we want to be comfortable there. And then my favorite mosque of all time is the one in, second favorite, is actually in Boston. And that has what they call a sister space, but it's not actually, so I've prayed in what was considered the brother space, and I've had the older aunties shoo me away. But I've also had the younger sisters come and pray next to me as well. But the barriers are very fluid, and they're just better. So I think, yay, women-only spaces, as long as the definition of women is not so narrow that it excludes people that we want there.
So I have also spent a lot of time in women's only spaces. Sometimes they're not defined as women-only spaces. So I worked for Curves for Women, which is a very explicitly, women's only space. But I've also done a lot of childcare work, and other work that like there are just not in there. So they become these sort of women's only spaces by default. And I think for me, one of the things that I always think about is the difference between a women's only space that is women's only and a women's space that is more explicitly a feminist space, and the difference between those two. And I feel really conflicted because I have found, there is a lot of comfort for me to be found in women's spaces. But there's also the recognition of if you have sort of men's spaces and women's spaces, and then you have people that identify as non-binary, what are their spaces, right? And so it's something that I really struggle with because a lot of my games are not women's only games in that the only people that can play them are women, but that they tend to focus on the experiences of women, right? So the characters are often women, or they're looking at women's spaces in the field of the game. And sort of how do I sort of recognize as a designer that can be exclusionary for players, right? And that are there ways to create spaces that have that same feeling that I so love about women's spaces, right? This idea that like people are going to listen to me and people are going to respect me, and that there is this sort of different like atmosphere that you can get, not in all, right? Curbs for Women was not always a super healthy, positive, awesome space to be in. But there is something about those spaces, right? And are there ways that we can create that in games in ways that are more welcoming to a larger group of players, right? I don't have that answer yet, but I think as feminist game designers, it's worth our thought and sort of attention.
One of the things that I've tried to do is create spaces for women to gather that are not what are typically permitted for women to gather in. So society permits women to gather to take care of children, right? Society permits women to gather to do women-y things, cook, clean, knit, whatever, these things that they've somehow decided are women-y things. Society permits women to get together in commodified ways. Let's get together for the sniffing party, whatever thing, and we're all going to buy something from each other. Let's all buy something. The Tupperware parties and the candle parties and this whatever. Like,
sniffy parties.
Yeah, the sniffy parties. It's a new large. We had sex toy parties, now we're going to have sniffy parties. All right, so, but these are very much women's spaces, but they're about women buying things from each other. Women are very much performing in a very capitalistic, commodified way, and they're very much also trying to improve to some sort of standards, right? Like you need to smell good, and you need to have the clothes that are right, or you need to make sure that you're going to be the nice hostess, so you have the right utensils, or whatever it is. And so those were spaces that were sort of considered women's spaces so often. So I wanted to say, let's create a role-playing experience where we can have a woman-only area, and they stop performing those kind of roles that are the only that are become so ingrained as this is how you are when you're with women. We all talk about woman things, right? And so it was like, okay, so in this woman space, like we have somebody who's a warrior, because the problem for me can be like you start saying what woman is. So here's the thing, I'm not a mom. And I'm in this space and all these people are talking about motherhood and like, am I not a woman? Like, I'm in this thing and I don't care about what kind of candle I have in the thing, am I not a woman, right? And so like opening that up and letting women role play other types of interactions that are real interactions that might take place in mixed spaces or in male-only spaces, or is something I've tried to do in games.
Yeah.
Because then you kind of you get to embody it and try it.
If I'm clear, you're allowing women to be people?
Radical idea. The t-shirts. Yeah.
I understand. Are they nursing while they're being people?
Yes, yes, but the laundry's on and they're cooking. No, of course not.
That comes back to, I wrote down an underlined roles here, because I think that we've been talking a lot about, role playing, obviously, and the roles that women play, and the roles that we associate with women. And I'd love to just get some tips for you guys about how to not design roles that are just like nurturing, caregiving, like your typical feminine, the feminine role type thing. How do you design so that you're not casting people purely in those parts?
I write gender neutral characters. That's one of the one I can no longer write gendered characters anymore. I shouldn't say I can't, but I prefer to write gender neutral characters because I think that I then step away from some more of these tropes that can happen. And then I'm looking at the story that I want this character to tell, to try to think about, and it's things like bucking against family expectations. Now, if I was writing that in a gendered way, I might have things in there that were like, and you were supposed to grow up to be a lady, but you wanted to ride horses, right? You know, or if I was writing this in a male way, it might be that you wanted to, you were supposed to be the master of the house, and you were really interested in dance, or something like that, and I'm falling into these sorts of things. So I'm like, how do I tell the story of going up against my expectations of my family without gendering that? And so that has opened up a lot for me. The other thing I want to say is...
When did you make that shift?
4 years ago, maybe? Yeah, about 4 years ago. Yeah. And the other thing is, I am not a very or traditionally feminine person, but that is also a valid identity, and so I have to try to walk, or even something to role play, right? And I have to try to remember. For me, I have to remember to include that or include that as an option, so we don't get the Hillary Clinton, I guess I'll bake cookies.
Because someone does want to play Sansa.
Someone, yeah, absolutely, right, and that's valid. And so one of the things I think that can happen is that we can put blinders on our own self for some of the things that we have found despicable or problematic, and then trying to make sure to broaden that.
Yeah, for me, I'm sort of the opposite experience, inclination. I tend to identify very strongly with lots of traditionally feminine things. But I grew up in a household where those were always, like, those were never seen as like frivolous or unimportant or weak or like waste of time, right? Like that was like this source of strength, it was a source of power, it was something important, it was something that was valued. And I think for me, then that informs a lot of my design because I want to complicate those kinds of characters. I want to complicate those narratives. I want to show, right, that like maybe the cook plays a really vital role in this story, or you can be nurturing and also be a warrior, right?
Shocking.
And creating these characters who sort of are deliberately there to bump up against some of these assumptions. And I like to write games about things that are often seen as like frivolous woman things, right? Sex toy parties, nail salons, beauty norms, right? And really like interrogate those and take them seriously as things that are worthy of examination and are worthy of our time. And so that for me is a a very important part of my game design.
I think I do something that's sort of in the middle. So, in like writing up a character or in a scenario, I pick their gender last, and if it's going to be that, or I leave that up to the player, with the understanding that okay, we all know, right, that gender is a social construct. So there are pieces of that social construct I think that are interesting and important in someone's own identity. So I do try to incorporate that experience if it's important in the story. So again, if I have a character that I want to see what the player brings to it, and what where they are with that, and how they read the character that I've created for them, or however it usually works like that. So that also means that I look at the tone of what I'm saying and how I'm describing this person before I do their gender. So let's say there's a character who's a nurse, and in our minds, a nurse is typically a woman. So if I'm going to describe this nurse as their occupation is denigrated or it's not important, I might not want to make that character specifically a woman. But if I say, well, this nurse is a nurse and does all kinds of amazing things beyond being a nurse, and what else is it about that character that I might learn as I'm writing them down, because they sort of, when you're writing, your characters sort of pop up and create themselves. And I've just found that my characters tend to create their gender last, if they do it all, and that in how, it really depends on how I'm describing. If I feel cynical about them, then things that are frivolous or silly, I'm going to be really careful, like if I'm going to make that gendered. Because otherwise I don't want to slip into a stereotype. But, I have times when I like wearing lipstick and makeup and stuff like that too. And I think that's important. It's an important part of my self-identity to like get dressed and, dye my gray purple. That's all that most people are going to see and things like that. It's kind of washing out. So I guess it's sort of in between. Like it's something that I think about, but it's the last thing unless it's just like so clearly this person is a woman, or so clearly this person is a man.
Well, from a feminist perspective, right, there's the multiple waves of feminism, right, and there's sort of the feminist thing that says anything you can do, I can also do, right, or I can do better. And so it's like we're going to have a bunch of characters that were women who are pilots or professional or I don't know, lion tamers, whatever. But that sort of reclaiming is trying to de-gender certain types of roles. But then that's can become an essentialist type of feminism, because then that also tends to support the binary and tends to sort of try to reinforce. Then you get the thing like she's a lady doctor, right? Because you have that.
Or even the idea that like.
Game developer party.
Yeah.
It's better to do these things that have traditionally been coded as for men or masculine over the things that have been traditionally coded as for women or feminine.
That's what the Hillary Clinton was.
Yep.
And so, and then the other type of feminism that so that's like we're the same as, you're a fireman, I can be a fireman, and of course firefighter, but it was and then the difference is, no, I'm a woman and I'm not a, right? So we're going to repudiate those things and so those both are things that struggle in feminism and feminist spaces, and are thankfully, thanks to more queer design and more stuff, moving away from trying to be X, not Y, or right, that sort of thing, and by like a person, pieces of both.
I would love to get questions from the audience. Let me see how much time we have left.
15 minutes.
We have about 15 minutes, perfect. So, if you folks have questions for our panelists. who are not ladies, but individuals.
I'm not a lady, I don't want to be a lady.
It's not so much a question, but it's just sort of a discussion topic. So some of what I've been doing with my feminist games is taking female practices that are marginalized and privileging them. So for instance, I made an electronic quilt game that was in Boston Festival of Independent Games a couple of years ago. And so the idea there was to take women's craft and foreground it with a game and electronics. So I just wanted to see about that a little bit, because you all kind of touched on that in different ways, but I'm curious about like that idea of taking this sort of traditional female experience and foregrounding and privileging it in some way.
I'd love to hear a description of what the sex toy party game is and what immersion is. Like how do those games play?
Well, that's a great, I'm curious, I can't even hear the names of half these games either, so hearing more about them would be awesome.
Okay. So, Sex Toy Party came out of a conversation about...
Is that the title?
Fun Party. No, it's called
Caddy Stanton's Candyland.
Yep.
What's it called?
Caddy Stanton's Candyland.
Like Elizabeth Cady stuff.
Like Elizabeth Caddy Stanton.
Yep.
Cady Stanton.
Yeah. Sorry, I just really processed that.
It's got a really great image.
Yeah, same town as Beaver College, which was a real college. I think it's Acadia College now, it's in Pennsylvania. I have an older cousin who went there. So, there's the bookstore owner, and when we ran it, the first time we ran it, you were the bookstore owner, and you were the Birkenstock wearing bookstore owner. And there was this a fun party. So there was, the bookstore owner had invited somebody to do this presentation. It was to get in touch with our sexual selves, and it was going to be all like lovey and touchy-feely. And here shows up this woman, Violet Ray, wearing, high-heeled boots, and was like the Cosmo girl of the 1970s, and was going to tell everybody about sex toys and about pleasing your man and things like that. And then come the participants, and we had the quiverful Catholic Phyllis Schlafly person. We had the probably closeted power suit wearing woman from the 70s. Actually kind of reminded me of my mom, who was a working woman in the 70s and the 80s. We had the college student who tried to portray herself as being way more sexually experienced than she actually was. We had the bisexual woman, whose sexuality was just completely erased by everybody. She was a college student. Yeah, she was a college student. And so they all gathered. And so there's first this miscommunication between the bookstore owner and Violet Ray about what this workshop really is about. And then we bring out the sex toys. And they were all actual toys, like dollar store toys or things that I got out of my kids' room. At the time, my 13-year-old was young because they came into the room and it was best NPC ever. So we had the players go through trying out the sex toys. You had to describe what it was. So we had one of those little paddles that has the ball attached to it. What's this? Then we had some clay, and we all molded vulvas. And then there was how to perform fellatio using some candy bars I picked up on the way to the game. And and then I also had some muffins because we had to take equal time. It was the 1970s. So we had, so there were a lot of these little games that we played and watched people get more and more comfortable, and then the characters were all bringing something. So power suit loosens up a little bit and starts flirting with the experienced college student and the very conservative, quiverful mom. You know, if you have a lot of kids, you probably have a lot of sex. You probably know some stuff. They all sort of, it's how they all get together and sort of find that common ground that maybe in real life never, maybe at least in this day and age.
Yeah. Yeah. And then the sort of sequel that we did was this bachelorette party where the person who was put in charge of the invitation mistakenly invites like the entire family of both the bride's family and the groom's family. And so you've got like abuela there and the soon-to-be mother-in-law and the soon-to-be sister-in-law. And we kept a lot of the same activities. We did some lingerie pictures.
Oh yeah, drive along. The flag.
But part of the way that we came to design these games was that we were sitting one night having a conversation, and I was telling the story about someone who had actually gone to a bachelorette party where everybody's family had been there, and it had been this really uncomfortable thing for them, and they were just so embarrassed. And I was telling this story, and Julia says, I've never been to one of those sex toy parties, and I've always wanted to. And I was like, same for me. And then, as you do, we were like, let's make a LARP. And as we were, starting to design this LARP, we started getting into this conversation about sort of feminism and, some of the clashes in feminism and some of the erasures that happen in feminism and what kind of, who has space in feminist spaces, right? And who, so it became a lot more about sort of playing with that and sort of making visible some of these clashes and issues that came up in the 70s, but in many ways are still being dealt with by feminists today. So it was sort of this mix of a lighthearted exploration of sex toy parties and some of these issues that we actually wanted to sort of explore in a little more depth, similarly to the sort of like religion and sexuality and conservative versus liberal stuff. So, yeah.
Emerton is a fantasy world that's sort of sprung from my idea of I loved Themyscira, but Themyscira, everybody's a warrior, an Amazon warrior, so what if we had a Themyscira type society, but we had many different roles and many different things. And Emerton is unmoored from time and space, so that you can have real historical women from throughout history or women from other worlds that are there, and they can get to this liminal space that is Emerton, because what we're trying to create is a conversation between, the last one we had somebody who was, let's see if I can get this, somebody who was with Hildegard of Bingen, somebody was with Hildegard of Bingen, somebody who was with the librarian, Hypatia.
Yes.
Someone who was an acolyte of Hypatia.
It's like we had all the big names.
Yeah, we had somebody who was a Quaker, with somebody who was with Gertrude Stein. Yeah, we didn't have Gertrude Stein, but we had, that way you don't have to try to recreate, but you had somebody who was in the salon with Gertrude Stein, a mentor, a mentee. And so somebody from the Quaker, we had people who were related to which family was that? I've lost it now. But there was up with the Underground Railroad and relatives with the people so they were at the women's convention. And then we had some people who were from completely different worlds where women were never oppressed or from other things. And we had people from this society where they were having trouble. And so these women were all together and could have these conversations about these different kinds of experiences, but then could also learn from each other. And then because this was this portal, and Merchant's this portal like the genie and Aladdin where the exits are here, right? Like you can go back to any sort of time and space and take these learnings into that solved the problems that they might have had in their wherever they came from. Emerton was a place to come and learn from other women and be in this space. So there's lots of sharing. And then everybody had a vocation. So we worked really hard to undo womanhood from reproductive things, right? So undo the maiden, mother, crone stereotype and turn it into different stages that were not based on that. They were based more on growth and also not consider it as a linear thing. Just because I can still be in the child stage even if I'm actually in the grandma stage, right? I can move among those sorts of things. And then we made the vocations ways so that we were undoing tries of ways to make that they were women's work. So somebody who was a welder and someone who is a psychologist, someone who's a healer, someone who is, those are all menders, right? In the center, someone might have been a tailor, they're completely different, but they had this calling in the menders to fix and to do, but whereas and then tenders were people who tended things, so they might have been gardeners, but they might have also been childcare people. So trying to upend a lot of those things to broaden this experience.
One of the things that I really enjoyed about Emerton was that we also had lots of different activities that you could engage in.
Cooking.
We had cooking. We went out and I got to shoot some boffer arrows, which I had never done before, and it was this really awesome thing. And so really having that
multiplicity of we'll do art, we'll do cooking, we'll go out and fight with swords, control the parameters of the borders.
We did like braiding of hair and some other things.
Lots of temporary tattoos happened.
Just
collecting rocks and things in the desert, and then coming back and building stuff with them. So I felt like there was really this multiplicity that was really recognized throughout the game.
You talked about patrolling and fighting. Who were the adversaries in the setting? Or there were no adversaries?
Ourselves, God. We did not set up NPC adversaries.
No.
Not at all. But the idea of being vigilant and of guarding the space, as keeping Emerton as a sanctuary, was a very dedicated job. But there were no, we did not create a thing that they had to fit.
Well, and also there was this idea that when we were practicing fighting, a lot of times it was because many of us who were at Emerton would then be going back to fight the good fight in our own worlds, right? And another thing that I really enjoyed in particular about the warriors was that the warriors were not all fighters, right? That what a warrior meant, and then even that there were these really great discussions among the warriors about what it meant to be a warrior, right? Was the sword your only tool, or could you use a pen? Or was sort of passive resistance as powerful as active resistance? And getting to have those kinds of discussions was also really important.
I think
We're
just
there.
about out of time.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much.